This is episode 8 of The War We're Not Being Told the Full Story About, an economic analysis for Africa and the Caribbean by me, Charmaine Hayden. So in the previous episode, we looked at Cuba and what happens when a country loses access to the fuel that keeps its entire economy running. Electricity grids fail, hospitals struggle to operate, and food supply chains collapse. But the global energy crisis does not produce the same outcome for everyone. In some countries, it creates shortages, and in others, it creates opportunity. And nowhere is that contrast sharper right now than Nigeria. So let's talk about the quiet build-up for Nigeria. On Christmas Day 2025, the United States conducted airstrikes on Nigerian soil for the first time. They said it was ISIS-linked camps in Sokoto State that they were targeting, and by February 3rd, Special Forces groups was operating inside the country. 200 personnel deployed by the end of the month. AFRICOM's deputy commander described Nigeria as a security anchor for West Africa. The United States maintains at least 34 known military outposts across Africa, with Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti alone hosting, I think it's 4,000 personnel, and costing the US between $63 and $70 million each year in rent. But Nigeria's story in this crisis is not about security. It's about economics, and it starts in Lagos with Dangote's refinery, right, which is arguably Africa's biggest industrial story. On February 11th, the Dangote Petroleum Refinery reached its full nameplate capacity of 650,000 barrels per day. That makes it the largest single-train refinery ever built anywhere in the world. It sits on more than 6,000 acres in the Lekki Free Trade Zone, connected by over 1,100 kilometres of subsea pipeline. Its CEO, David Bird, confirmed the milestone after 72-hour performance tests verified that their crude distillation and gasoline production units were running at full efficiency. In order to understand why this matters, you have to understand what came before it. Nigeria, Africa's largest oil producer, spent decades importing more than 80% of its refined fuel. The country was producing the raw material and then paying billions of dollars every year to buy it back as petrol and diesel. The state refineries in Port Harcourt, Warri and Kaduna operated at near zero capacity for years. And the government spent more subsidizing imported fuel than it earned from crude exports in some quarters. So Nigeria was the only top 10 oil producer on earth that could not refine its own crude oil. That is the colonial economic model in its purest form, as we know. You extract the raw material, ship it abroad, and then purchase the finished product back at a markup. And you do it year after year after year until the structure feels permanent, until people forget that it was ever supposed to even be different. Dangote's refinery is designed to break that cycle. At full capacity, it can deliver up to 75 million litres of petrol per day. Nigeria's daily consumption sits between 50 and 60 million litres. For the first time in the country's history, a single domestic facility can meet all of the national demand and still have surplus for export. So in January 2026, Dangote supplied roughly 62% of Nigeria's total petrol. The company has announced plans to supply 65 million litres daily to the domestic market, with 15 to 20 million litres for export across the West Africa. Analysts estimate that this could save Nigeria up to $10 billion per year in foreign exchange that was previously spent importing refined fuel. Now, I should be honest with you guys about that number, because that $10 billion figure assumes full capacity, full domestic crude supply, and full displacement of imports. None of those three things are simultaneously true right now. The real savings at the current throughput are lower, right? But even at 60 to 70% of that number, it is transformational. Every litre refined domestically is a litre that doesn't require dollars to import. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, because I've seen the comments online, right? I've seen the posts. If Dangote is here and he exists and he's refining fuel, why are pump prices still going up? And here's the answer. And I need you to hear this clearly. Nigeria operates under deregulation. That means fuel is priced at international benchmark rates, regardless of where the crude comes from. Nigerian crude, international price tag. So when Brent jumps up $70 to $94, your pump price jumps too, even if every drop was sourced and refined domestically. That is the trade-off of deregulation. It is painful, especially at $94. But here's what deregulation replaced. The old system was a fuel subsidy that was consuming more money than the government earned from crude exports. It was bankrupting the country. And under that old system, you were still paying international prices. You were just paying them invisibly through inflation, currency collapse, and government debt that your children would inherit. So yes, pump prices are rising, but without Dangote, you would still be paying the global crude price, plus a foreign refining margin, plus international shipping costs, plus import duties. Dangote removed 3 of those 4 costs. The one cost it cannot remove is the global price of crude itself. Nobody can. Not Dangote, not the government, not OPEC. When a war shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, crude prices rise everywhere on earth. The question is not whether you pay more. The question is how much more. And for the first time, Nigeria is in a paying less than everyone else situation, right? Now consider what happens when this industrial capacity collides with a global energy crisis. Before the strikes on Iran, Brent crude was trading around $70 to $72 a barrel. By Friday, it had surged to $94, the highest since September 2023. And this morning, I think the market opened at 109? You can correct me if I'm wrong, right? $109. Analysts are projecting up to $120 if the Strait of Hormuz remained contested. But there are also reports saying that it could go up to as much as $200. So we're actually past the Goldman Sachs $100 trigger. And every dollar increases in crude prices raises the value of Nigeria's crude exports. But here's the part that is going unnoticed largely. It simultaneously raises the cost of refined fuel imports for every country that does not have domestic refining capacity. Again, Nigeria for the first time is on the right side of that equation. Think about what that means for the rest of West Africa. Ghana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Togo, Burkina Faso, all of them import refined fuel. All of them are now paying dramatically more for those imports because of the shipping surcharges and the oil price increases. Dangote is already exporting refined products into neighbouring markets, displacing imports from European refineries and reshaping regional fuel flows. According to the Argus European Products Report, Dangote has become the most dominant market player in Nigeria, with pricing so aggressive it undercuts competitors and sets the benchmark for the entire country. And then on Thursday, something happened that changed the calculus for every fuel importing country in Africa. China halted its fuel exports. Bloomberg reported that China's government ordered its largest refiners to immediately suspend exports of diesel and gasoline. The National Development and Reform Commission issued verbal instructions to halt all new export contracts and attempt to cancel existing shipments. China's wholesale diesel prices had already jumped 13.5% in a single week. Guys, this is China, the world's 3rd largest exporter of refined fuel, choosing to hoard supply for domestic use while the rest of the world scrambles. Ghana's High Street Journal ran the headline asking whether this was doomsday for Ghana's fuel supply. If other major refining centres follow China's lead, fuel importing economies across Africa face a supply crunch that no amount of money can fix because the product simply will not be available at any price. And this is why Dangote matters more today than it did last week. Dangote's refinery is now the only large-scale refining operation in sub-Saharan Africa. I say sub-Saharan, you know what I mean, in modern Africa, that can supply the region without relying on Gulf, European or Asian supply chains that are all under stress. Every West African government should be on the phone to Lagos today. And it's not just fuel. Dangote also operates a $2.5 billion fertilizer plant in Lekki with annual production capacity of 3 million metric tons of granular urea. It has already turned Nigeria into a net exporter of Nigerian-based fertilizers. The plant exports 77% of its output, shipping urea to Brazil, India, the United States, and Mexico. It earns approximately $7 million per day in dollar-denominated export revenue. Now, guys, remember what I told you earlier in this series about fertilizer. Urea prices have surged 13% in 4 days. The Northern Hemisphere planting season is about to begin. Qatar Energy, the world's largest LNG producer, which also supplies a significant share of global fertilizer feedstock is shut down under force majeure. Gulf shipping routes are disrupted. Dangote's plant is one of the few major urea production facilities in the world that is completely outside the conflict zone and does not rely on Gulf shipping routes. At this moment, Dangote's fertilizer is strategically critical for global food production. Plans are underway to expand urea production to 12 million metric tons per year within 40 months, using technology from Germany. If realised, that would make Dangote larger than Qatar Fertilizer Company, currently the world's biggest urea producer at 5.6 million tonnes. Dangote has declared publicly that within 40 months, Africa will not need to import fertilizer from anywhere, and it is expanding beyond Nigeria. A 2.5 billion partnership with Ethiopian Investment Holdings will build a urea complex in Gode, in Ethiopia's Somali regional state, with capacity of 3 million metric tons per year. But guys, Nigeria economy is not just oil and fertilizer, and this crisis does not just hit through the fuel pump. It hits through every container that arrives at a Nigerian port. Nigeria is one of the largest importers of manufactured goods in Africa: plastics, machinery, electronics, chemicals, construction materials, consumer products. The goods that supply markets across Lagos, Kano, Aba. When war risk insurance surges and ships reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days and roughly $1 million in extra fuel per voyage. Those import costs rise across the board. CGM has imposed emergency conflict surcharges of $2,000 per standard container, $3,000 per 40-foot container, and $4,000 for refrigerated containers. Those costs do not stay with the shipping line. They land on the shelf. They land on the consumer. They land on the person in the market who has no idea why the price of a bag of rice or a box of electronics just went up. And then there is fish. This is one that's nobody's really talking about. Nigeria is the world's fourth largest fish importer by volume, behind only China, Japan, and the United States. The country imports over $1.2 billion worth of fish per year, according to FAO data. Domestic production covers roughly 1 million tonnes of the 3.2 million tonnes consumed annually. That is a supply deficit of over 2 million tonnes filled entirely by imports: frozen mackerel, herring, horse mackerel, croaker, shipped in from the US, Chile, Europe, and Asia. Every one of those shipments just got more expensive. Shipping surcharges, war risk premiums, rerouted vessels. If your imported frozen fish just went up 20% locally, farmed catfish and tilapia just became 20% more competitive. Nigeria is actually the world's largest producer of African catfish. The aquaculture sector employs over 1.4 million people. This crisis is a direct stimulus to the domestic fish production, if the sector can scale fast enough to capture the demand. Nigeria is also the world's fourth largest cocoa producer, behind Cote d'Ivoire, Indonesia, and Ghana, and the third largest exporter. Cocoa exports surged 298% in the first half of 2024, earning 644 billion naira as global cocoa prices tripled. But cocoa is a perishable export that depends on refrigerated shipping containers and timely logistics. CGM suspension of reefer bookings for conflict-adjacent routes and the war risk surcharges hitting West African ports mean that getting Nigerian cocoa to European and American chocolate manufacturers just got slower and more expensive. For a commodity where quality degrades with delay, every day in transit matters. I know there's a lot, guys, but now let me walk you through how all of this connects at the household level, because the finance ministers understand supply chains. The question is whether you do. It starts with fuel. When Brent crude rises from $70 to $94, the pump price follows. That is deregulation. But the pump price is not where it ends, it is where it begins. Because everything in Nigeria moves by road. The truck that brings tomatoes from Jos to Lagos runs on diesel. The motorcycle that delivers goods from Onitsha runs on petrol. The generator that keeps the shop open in Aba runs on diesel. When fuel prices rise, transport costs rise. When transport costs rise, wholesale food prices rise. When wholesale food prices rise, the woman selling tomatoes in Mile 12 Market in Lagos has to choose: raise her prices and lose customers, or hold her prices and lose her margin. She's not reading Goldman Sachs research notes. She's doing the maths on her fingers. And she is the economy. 80 to 90% of Nigerian employment is in the informal sector. Those workers do not have unions. They do not have hedging strategies. They absorb the shock in real time. And there is a health dimension nobody is discussing. When the price of cooking gas LPG rises, families who are already on the edge switch back to charcoal and firewood. Deforestation accelerates, respiratory illnesses increase, particularly in children and pregnant women. The WHO estimates that household air pollution from solid fuel kills over 100,000 Nigerians per year. An oil shock does not just raise prices, it reverses health progress. Nigeria also has a significant diaspora population working in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, those countries are under active Iranian attack, though it's subsided, right? Remittances from the Gulf are a meaningful source for foreign exchange. The immediate concern is the physical safety of those workers. The medium-term concern is what happens if remittance transfers are delayed by 30, 60, 90 days. But here is where I want to give you something practical, because this crisis also creates tools. Afrexim Bank's Pan-African Payment Settlement System, PAPS, allows businesses to trade across African borders in local currencies without needing dollars. The dollar just got more expensive. Every system that lets you avoid it saves you money. If you are a Nigerian business trading with Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, or anywhere else on the continent, PAPS is now a competitive advantage rather than just a convenience. Solar energy, the cost of diesel generators just went up. The cost of sunlight stayed at zero. If you have technical skills in solar installation, this is a growth industry about to accelerate. Every business owner calculating whether to run their generator for an hour is doing a solar playback calculation that makes more sense today than it did 2 weeks ago. And Dangote's expansion to 1.4 million barrels per day, if completed in 3 years, using the $400 million equipment deal signed with China's XCMG, would make Nigeria home to the largest refinery on earth, surpassing India's Jamnagar, just not an industrial story. This is a geopolitical story. It changes Nigeria's position in every trade negotiation for the next generation. Now, I know the Dangote question is coming because it always comes. People will say he's building a monopoly, that he's capturing state resources for private gain. Those concerns are legitimate and they deserve scrutiny. I'm not here to tell you that one man should control your country's energy infrastructure unchallenged. But I will say this, right? I've said it before. If not him, then who? Because before Dangote, the answer was nobody. The state refineries failed. They were revived. They went offline again. The government spent decades promising refining capacity it could not deliver. The private sector did not step in at scale, and while everyone debated, Nigeria kept exporting crude and importing fuel and losing $1.79 billion a year on the exchange. If you do not like a private monopoly, fine, build the public alternative. But do not use the monopoly argument to defend the status quo, because the status quo was paying other countries to do what Nigeria should have been doing for itself. Some economists would argue that the US-Nigeria trade surplus is just comparative advantage, that Nigeria exports what it has and imports what it needs. But when a country exports raw crude at a discount, then imports the exact same crude back as refined fuel at a markup, and the net result is $1.79 billion deficit on petroleum products alone, calling that comparative advantage is generous. The structure is extractive. The question is whether or not it stays that way. Guys, I know this is lengthy, but I'm getting into it, aren't I? And I'm almost done. Let me show you exactly how broken the structure has been. In 2025, Nigeria supplied 46.6 million barrels of crude to the United States, 42% of all African crude exports to the US. Nigeria is by far Africa's largest crude supplier to America. But while the US was buying Nigeria's raw crude, it was simultaneously exporting more machinery, refined petroleum products, and agricultural goods back to Nigeria than it imported. The result, a $1.79 billion US trade surplus. Let that sink in. Africa's largest oil producer is running a trade deficit with the country buying its crude. And it gets worse. In March 2025, the United States actually became a net crude oil exporter to Nigeria for the first time in history. The Dangote refinery, because it could not secure enough domestic crude for NMPC, was importing American light sweet crude to run its operations. By July 2025, US crude made up 60% of Dangote's import mix, while Nigerian domestic grades accounted for just 40%. Nigeria was importing American oil to refine in a Nigerian refinery because its own national oil company could not deliver sufficient supply. That is the absurdity that this war can break. And the demand shift is not theoretical, it is actually already happening. India's largest state-owned refiner, Indian Oil Corporation, has purchased 6 million barrels of crude for April delivery. Specifically, they bought Pasflor crude from Angola, Agbami crude from Nigeria through Total Energies. They also purchased Bonny Light and Akpo crudes from Nigeria through Shell. India's crude imports hit 5.3 million barrels per day in February. Russian crude arrivals fell to 1 million barrels per day and down from 1.6 million. That gap is being filled by African barrels. Indian refiners are placing orders today for Nigerian crude that they were buying from Russia 6 months ago. And on Friday, the US Treasury issued India a 30-day waiver to resume buying Russian oil, reversing its own trade deal because the supply crisis is that severe. When the country that started the war starts undoing its own sanctions to manage the consequences, you know the disruption has exceeded what they planned for. Now, here are the honest constraints, because I'm not going to sell you a dream without showing you the cracks. Nigeria produced just 1.46 million barrels per day in January 2026 against an OPEC quota of 1.5 million, the sixth consecutive month below target. Over the past 13 months, Nigeria has forfeited an estimated $1.31 billion in potential crude revenue through production shortfalls, totaling 18.12 million barrels. The government's 2026 budget assumes production at 1.84 million barrels per day. Actual output is running at 380,000 barrels short of that, a 20% gap between fiscal planning and operational reality. The reasons are infrastructure decay, oil theft that still costs billions, security challenges in Niger Delta, and what Dangote himself has described as corruption in the oil industry that prevents him from securing enough domestic crude supply. Forward crude oil sale agreements totaling $21.56 billion across 11 deals since 2018 also constrain the upside. Nigeria's pre-sold future production at prices well below where the market is now trading. Debt servicing swallows over 30% of government revenue, and the Naira trading around 1,370 to the dollar, you can correct me if that needs correcting, means that dollar-denominated costs eat into domestic purchasing power even as the dollar revenues increase. So the opportunity is real, but it's also fragile. And guys, I want to speak to the finance ministers and the central bank governors for a moment, because here is what the global strategists will tell you. Nigeria entered this crisis in a stronger fiscal position than most of the continent. External reserves at 13-year high of $49.5 billion. Inflation cooling from the 10th consecutive month to 15.1%. The central bank having just cut the monetary policy rate by 50 basis points to 26.5%. But that easing cycle is now frozen. Bloomberg reported that Iran war oil shock threatens to disrupt Africa's entire rate cutting cycle. 9 African countries cut rates in February. None will cut in March. South Africa's Reserve Bank governor had already said his previous worst-case scenario is obsolete. He assumed $75 oil and a rand at 18.50, oil at $94. The models are broken. So for Nigeria specifically, the window of action is 4 to 6 weeks. That is how long before the oil shock fully transmits into CPI data. Lock in forward fuel purchase agreements now. Secure bilateral crude supply contracts for Dangote. Not at spot prices, but at term contracts that guarantee volume, please, right? Draw down the bilateral credit lines. Do not wait for inflation data to confirm what the market is already telling you. Governments that wait until the numbers arrive have already lost. And I want to speak directly to the person watching this right now, not the finance minister, not the central bank governor, but you. If you are in Lagos right now, you already know that the prices are moving. You feel when you fill up your car, you feel when you buy rice, you feel when the woman selling tomatoes in mile 12 market raises her price because the cost of getting those tomatoes to her stall just went up. That woman is the economy, and she is not in anyone's advisory. The bottom line on Nigeria. Nigeria has, for the first time in its history, the industrial infrastructure to be a net exporter of refined fuel and major global fertilizer producer. The Iran war has created the exact market conditions, high crude prices, disrupted Gulf supply chains, global fertilizer shortage, China halting fuel exports that maximize the value of what Dangote has built. If Nigeria can solve its production shortfall, secure consistent crude supply to the refinery, and manage the fiscal constraints of pre-sold oil and debt servicing, it is positioned for the most significant economic upgrade of any country in this crisis. The question is not whether or not the opportunity exists, it is whether Nigeria's institution can capture it. And the clock is running because when the Strait of Hormuz reopens, and it will eventually, the window closes, the leverage shrinks, the world goes back to its old patterns, and if Nigeria has not moved by then, it will have watched the greatest economic opportunity of a generation pass by while its leaders debated. This is the Dangote moment. Use it.